Good evening, and welcome to SkepTalk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm the president of Bay Area Skeptics, and it is my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, AJ White. Now, I first became aware of AJ's work because I was browsing around the internet one day, as one does, and I came across an article in the Smithsonian that was talking about how archaeologists are using biomarkers to make population estimates, which I thought was a pretty neat thing. And I think I might have kind of buried the lead on tonight's talk because guess what? I had a fun little slideshow here for you that is not working. So don't go away. There's going to be some more fun stuff. Here we go. As I say, I think we kind of buried the lead on this talk because the Smithsonian article was talking about how AJ's research used a human biomarker found in feces to help him estimate population estimates through time, population changes and numbers, which is a very difficult problem in archaeology, by using lakebed sediments through nearby a very famous Midwestern archaeological site called Cahokia, which I'm sure he'll tell you more about. But I thought it was a really nifty way to estimate population and that it would be a lot of fun to hear about. On the other hand, this is Bay Area Skeptics. And although we have on many occasions just had straight up science presentations, and this could have been one of those, I got to thinking about how, there's some issues in skepticism that an archaeologist could bring a very interesting perspective onto. So it occurred to me that someone whose research involved reconstructing prehistoric population numbers would be an excellent person to talk to us about lost civilizations. As skeptics, we know a lot of claims that are made about lost civilizations from the Middle East, South America, to the American West, Southeast Asia, pretty much every place except maybe Antarctica. There are tales about lost civilizations and breathless accounts of why did these people mysteriously disappear, with explanations ranging from being spirited away by ancient astronauts, or they built spaceships and went off, or they disappeared into the hollow inside of the earth, and all sorts of really quite fanciful explanations. Well, needless to say, archaeologists have rather different perspectives on this kind of situation. And I thought that having AJ with us tonight would be extremely interesting to tell us about lost civilizations. So AJ, tell us about lost civilizations.
Hi, Dr. Scott. Thanks so much for having me here today. And I think that there's quite a lot that we can talk about. I'll be focusing the talk, however, on Cahokia, as you mentioned. But to really begin today, I'd like everyone that is watching right now to bear with me for a moment and use your imagination. What I'd like you to do is pretend that you're getting into a time machine. And the time machine, it goes far back in time, but geographically, assuming that you're in America, you're not going that far. In fact, you're just going to the American heartland. And when you step out of the time machine, you emerge onto this ancient city. And you look at the city and it's clearly bustling. There are thousands of people. You quickly understand that it was an economic center, and that they were producing almost like factories. And out of these factories came prestige goods that were not just confined to the site, but they were spread all throughout the land. You could find them in what we now know as Canada, all the way down to Mexico. And with that trade came all sorts of wealth to this place. And there were these almost, you could think of them like skyscrapers that the wealthiest folks were living upon. And the place was culturally very wealthy as well. You could find the arts that were practiced at this place all throughout the local area. So they exported not just their prestige goods, but their culture. And just like any sort of modern city, you could go see a sports game, right? You could go find an arena. And an interesting thing in these arenas, archaeologists have found, and this is quite controversial, by the way, what appears to be an icon or maybe even a symbol of a lion, which is pretty odd, right? Because this is North America. There aren't lions here. They haven't been here since the Pleistocene. So what's going on? Assuming that you believe that it is a lion, that would imply that either they're having some far-fetched connection to other continents, or maybe there's some sort of very deep connection to the past. And there's this cultural memory of these ancient beasts. So we'll leave that aside for now. But then you step back into your time machine and you set the dial for a couple decades later. When you get out again, the area is in decline. And you move forward once more in your time machine. And by this time, when you step out, the area is abandoned. The people have vanished. Where did they go? Who were they? It's a great mystery. And you have found indeed a lost civilization. And the city that I'm discussing here, of course, is Detroit, Michigan. I'm gonna hope that I, caught a couple of people here with this kind of trick. Because it's actually pretty easy to make a lost civilization narrative. You just need a little bit of archaeological evidence and an imagination, and you can do a lot with that. So let me show you how I was able to make this lost civilization trope out of Detroit, Michigan in the 20th century. So I mentioned that it was this great city that had skyscrapers. Sure enough, Detroit has skyscrapers. I mentioned that the skyscrapers were possible because of the city's great wealth. And while it's not so much true now, in the early to mid 20th century, Detroit was a major industrial center of America and perhaps even the world. And that was driven literally by the automotive industry. So to this day, Ford and General Motors are headquartered in Detroit. And with all that trade, they were, the prestige goods were these cars. And so there's all this wealth. But in addition to the wealth, in terms of money, there's also a wealth of culture from Detroit. And there's been all sorts of great, music coming out of Detroit to this day. But I'd say the one that really stands out is Motown, right? So here we have the Temptations on the left and Diana Ross and Supremes on the other side. We could have picked so many more, iconic figures from Motown, but that's kind of the cultural exports that I was talking about from Detroit. And finally, I had some fun with this, but the lions, right? So I talked about how archaeologists found, an icon of a lion. I think sometimes we in archaeology can say a lot off of things that we don't know for sure exactly what the symbolic meaning was. In this case, the lion just was, I don't really know why the Detroit Lion football team are called the Lions. They just are. So if you put all of that together, you have this, bustling ancient metropolis. And by ancient, it's a relative term. I mean, a little over less than 100 years ago. But it indeed it indeed is a place that experienced a degree of abandonment. And the archaeological record has kicked in Detroit, where there are places that are no longer in use. They're abandoned. In fact, I believe currently Detroit's population is a little bit over a third of its population maximum reached in the mid 20th century, which is a pretty steep population decline, right? And if you were to just see the remains of this decline, the abandoned sites, you'd start to think, oh wow, look at how you start getting that romantic lost civilization narrative forming in your head. Who would build such great buildings and structures only to let them rot under the sun, right? And you can start to make this in your head. But when I talk about Detroit, it's ridiculous to think of it as a lost civilization, right? Because of course, there are people that are still there. And the people who left Detroit, they didn't vanish. They just moved elsewhere to find better opportunities. And that is most often the case for a lot of these so-called lost civilizations. The people didn't, catastrophically die or something. It was generally just no longer a place that could support a large population, and people went elsewhere. Not necessarily meaning that the culture goes away, just that particular place. And I can't think of any better evidence to say that Detroit is still very well on the map than to say, hey, look at the Detroit Lions. I mean, they are the worst team in the NFL right now. They're 1-10. 1-10. And they can still get people to come out to football games. You can say the same thing about the Detroit Pistons. They're 4-20 right now. They've lost 10 games in a row, and people still come out. So there are clearly still people there. It sounds ridiculous to say that this is some sort of lost civilization. But if you just saw this, if you only saw the archaeological record, that is the material remains that are no longer in use by modern people, you would start to perhaps go on that frame of mind that I started with in the presentation. And it's quite easy to do. And this happens throughout the world. And I want to show you how the lost civilization trope can develop, and also its pitfalls, as well as how it can be something that I think is actually dangerous and damaging to people who are alive today at a very real archaeological site, which is called Cahokia. So Dr. Scott mentioned in the beginning that I'd be talking about Cahokia. And I had this kind of as a red herring at the beginning to say, oh, this ancient city, and I was talking about Detroit. But in this case, I am talking about a real ancient city. It's Cahokia. And for those of you who aren't aware of it, because sadly, this is it's the largest archaeological site in America, but not that many Americans actually know that much about it, which I find kind of surprising. The first thing to know is that it is this pre-contact North American, Native American site that is incredibly large. In fact, I've called it a city. And about 1,000 years ago, people started to aggregate around this part of the Mississippi River. So where Cahokia is in southern Illinois, and you can see the Mississippi River right next to it. It's right across from modern day St. Louis. And this map, in addition to showing where it is in America, also shows all of the UNESCO World Heritage sites in our country. And so Cahokia has the distinction of being one of the handful of UNESCO World Heritage sites in our country. And again, it's fascinating to me that still it's not particularly well known, despite that. So when we look at Cochia on the ground, what it looks like today are many massive earthen monumental mounds. So I mentioned that this was a city that started developing about 1,000 years ago. And people in this culture, which was called the Mississippian culture, would build these mounds that had probably different purposes. But we know that people who probably had a degree of power were inhabiting the top of the mounds. These were built all over the place. And the largest one is what we see here in this image, which is called Monk's Mound. And to give you a sense of its scale, the base area of it is approximately the same as the Great Pyramid of Giza. So it's absolutely massive. Now, it's not as tall as the Great Pyramid, but for the Mississippi River Valley, which is really flat, it's still really dang tall. You know, you go up on top of it and you are the tallest thing around. You're above the trees. And the only thing that breaks your view is the modern skyline of St. Louis. So 1,000 years ago, you know, if you're on top of one of these mountains, you're really on top of what is effectively this ancient skyscraper. And I mentioned Monk's Mound, but there are over 100 mounds that we know of at Cahokia. So I was just showing you one of over 100, and there were probably a lot more. We know that Cahokia kind of stretched in an arc from the center of it as it is today out towards St. Louis. And there are many mounds in St. Louis that were destroyed due to the development of the city in the 1800s that we have almost no record of anymore. So it was even bigger than we know it to be now. So given how big it was and how many people lived there, a big question is, you know, what happened, right? How do you get from being this big city with a lot of people to an archaeological site? And this is an engaging question that I've been very interested for a long time. And to start to answer this question, you first need to know what's going on with demographics. What's going on with population, right? You need to know, when is it that people started to, you know, no longer live around here? And as Dr. Scott mentioned, figuring out paleodemography, you know, or how many people lived around an area in the past, is really hard to do if you don't have historical documents. If you don't have something like a census that says in the year 1423, there were 10,100, you know, 10,100 people, say. If you don't have that, it's actually pretty difficult to do. So traditional estimates use things like the number of houses that were excavated, the number of burials that were dug up, and you try to figure out where they fall through time. And, you know, it's an estimate. And I could show you the pre-existing estimates for Cahokia based on those methods, but I think that's less fun. I'm going to show you the method that I use to get at population, which is, as was hinted at the beginning of the talk, using poop, using fecal molecules. So I'll explain first how this process works, and then we'll see what can we do with that fecal molecule population reconstruction to, you know, pick apart the lost civilization trope as it applies to Cahokia. So first of all, let's talk about poop for just a minute. And the basic idea that we're working up towards is the idea that if there are more people defecating on a landscape and you're finding a fair amount of fecal molecules, that suggests that there was a lot of people present there in the past. And if there are less fecal molecules, then there would be less people. So that's the basic idea. But let me tell you more about the molecules that are involved here. So this is kind of the sciencey part of our talk. And the biomarker under discussion is caprostenol. And caprostenol has a much more well-known parent molecule, which is cholesterol. So it's what, 7:45 right now? Maybe it's past dinner time. If you had any sort of meat for dinner, you're going through exactly what's going on in the schematic, whether you like it or not. And if you're a vegetarian, you're still making cholesterol because you're an animal, and it's going to find its way to your gut. You'll just be making a lot less of this stuff. But the point is, cholesterol in our gut, you know, either, you know, through food coming in or otherwise, will start to get, you know, it'll try to be eaten by our gut microbes. And cholesterol is a pretty rigid molecule. It's not very attractive as food, even to microbes. And so they can't degrade very much of it. And so they basically, for lack of a better word, just kind of nibble at it. And they slightly alter the molecular structure enough to give it a new name. And it's now called caprostenol. And caprostenol is something that is, you know, a waste product of your gut bacteria. And so if it gets to that point, it's clearly not useful to you, and it's not useful to your bacteria. And so that essentially, those two qualifications are what makes poop. That's all it is, really. It's just the stuff that your bacteria and your gut doesn't want and that your intestine can't make use of. So caprostenol is actually a significant amount of human stools. This one molecule can make up to about a 0.5% of a human stool, which in terms of, one specific molecule, that's a lot. And so there are other animals that can make caprosenol. And there are many animals that don't really make it at all. And humans make far more of it than almost any other animal that we've tested. So because we are the predominant producer of this molecule, you can make a tight association between its presence and human presence. So once people defecate, you're introducing caprosenol to the environment. And you got to imagine a time before plumbing. And you don't have to go that far back in time to find this. I mean, it's kind of an interesting like Wikipedia binge if you want to learn about the history of plumbing. Although, things that resemble toilets are quite old. They, in very specific parts of the world, they didn't become widely, used until the last couple of centuries. And so for much of human history, people are either using, outhouses more or less, or practicing open defecation, which still is done by millions of people today in rural areas. And so you got to imagine a time where people are out and about on the landscape. Maybe they're out farming, they're out fishing, hunting, chopping down wood, out on, a military patrol. They're kids, they're just playing. There's a number of reasons why you could be away from your house and you need to go to the bathroom. You just take care of business. And that's just kind of spread out evenly throughout the land. And you could see how after it rained, that small amounts of fecal material would dissolve in the water and be transported to a low point on the land, which is generally a lake where it would collect. And that caprosenol within the fecal matter would fall down to the bottom of the lake and be deposited. Now, unlike most components of feces, caprosenol can probably last for hundreds of thousands of years. And the reason for that is that it's a really just unattractive molecule to bacteria. Think of it as the sloppy seconds of your gut microbes ending up to other microbes. They're going to prefer any sort of sugars or anything else, basically. And so combined with the fact that many lake environments become anoxic once they get buried enough, this stuff can just last for a long time. And so caprosenol, gets deposited. And if there's a lot of people on the land at that time during that depositional event, that's going to bring in a lot of feces. It's going to bring a lot of the molecules, meaning that there's a lot of people present. Let's skip ahead to the next season. Maybe everybody left. There's not going to be a lot of feces washed in. And so there'll be less of these molecules. So by us going and taking a sediment core through a lake and measuring the amount of these molecules present through time, you end up with what we argue to be a proxy of human population within a watershed, basically. Now, fortunately, there's a lake right outside of Cochia. It's called Horseshoe Lake. It's a horseshoe lake it's an oxbow lake that is of the Mississippi. So it's really shallow, so you can like wade out into it for pretty much almost the entire length of the lake. Anyway, we got some sediment cores, and we were able to work those cores up and say, because Cochia is right next to the lake, this Cochia's feces would end up here, and we can use this as a population reconstruction. So to show you the results of this, and this is an overly complicated graph, I apologize. Let me take a little sip for a second here to prepare me for explaining everything. So the first thing to note, so on the x-axis, we got time from 800 to 1600 AD. On the y-axis, I have something that's called ratio 1. If you want to know more about why it's ratio 1, you can read the paper about this. I'm going to leave that out. Just know that basically the higher that ratio value, we argue that means that there is more people present. So more positive, more people. And the white line, or sorry, the black line and the gray line towards the top of this figure are the fecal molecule results of two different cores, and each line gets its own core. And what we see on the bottom with the blue and the red lines, those are traditional population estimates for Cochia using archaeological data that I talked about before. And so when I started this project, I was thinking, hey, Cahokia has these traditional population estimates. let's use this method to see if it mirrors that, and if we can say, hey, this method works. And sure enough, they broadly match each other. We find that there's a population maximum somewhere between 1000 and 1100 AD, so basically the 11th century. And they both agree that by the beginning of the 12th century, this area is in a population decline. And it's a particularly long-lasting depopulation that continues till about 1400, when the area is said to be abandoned. And so a big question is why, right? I mean, we talked about this earlier. So we have this big depopulation. We got this abandonment. What caused it? And the point of today's talk is not to get into this, because I think it's a fascinating question. I've done a lot of research about it myself. Many other people have done research about it. But that's not the point of today. But with the research that's come out of trying to explain this population decline, I want to focus on the language that we're using and this emphasis on it. So of these many ideas that come out, we talk about degradation, population decline. The middle study is my own study. So I'm not trying to exclude myself from this emphasis on the decline. I'm guilty of it as well. Cochia's boom and bust, Cochia's collapse and abandonment. A large fraction of all the research about this site really narrows in on decline and abandonment and collapse. So we focus so much about this. And although this is a really interesting subject, and I think it's worth pursuing, by really making all the attention go on the negative, on the decline, this is how it gets picked up in the next level of literature, outside of academic literature. If we go into kind of more popular science literature, I'm not sure if folks have read either of these books, but they're books written by academic folks intended for more of a popular audience, like Collapse. And Jared Diamond only brings up Cochia very briefly as an example of collapse. But in 1491, Charles Mann has a majority of a chapter devoted to Cochia. And I'd like to read just a component of that description to kind of say how this emphasis on decline finds its way into kind of popular science. So he talks about how for all of their energy, Cochia's rulers made a terrible mistake. So there are many ideas for what led to this depopulation, but the one that's picked up in this book is that it's the fault of the people at Cahokia. They made a mistake. And then going on several sentences later, we talk about how Cochia's rulers focused on maintaining their hold over the people, paying little attention to external reality. By 1350 AD, the city was almost empty. Never again would such a large Indian community exist north of Mexico. Never again would there be such a large Indian community. So that really implies a lot of finality, doesn't it? To say, oh, 1350, that's the height of Native Americans, essentially, according to this, right? I mean, if you just go off of that, let alone the fact that I'm sure you could find towns in Oklahoma and places like that that might have a population of mostly indigenous people that approaches or exceeds that of Cahokia. That's where the emphasis lies, and that's the end of the discussion about Cahokia in this book. It ends in abandonment. Now let's take that one step even further to say, okay, well, where does it go in more general broad media, right? And things like newspaper articles. So you can, after tonight's talk, you can just Google Cahokia and see what comes up. Some stuff is great. Some stuff not as great. And some stuff really plays into this lost civilizations trope that is the subject of our talk today. And what, just makes it apparent is like this article here is part of an entry of or a series of articles about lost cities. So it says it in the title, right? So let's look at the language here and break that down for a second. So the mystery of Cahokia. Why did North America's largest city vanish? So yeah, I mean, using this vocabulary that makes it seem like it just went poof, everyone went away. Where did they go? Who knows, right? Now, the next set of text I pulled, it's not the first paragraph, but it's one that stood out to me, and I'd like to talk about it for a moment. So I'll read it to you first. So, but rather than developing like London into a modern metropolis, Cahokia is more like the fabled lost continent of Atlantis. Having become a major population center around 1050, by 1350 is largely abandoned by its people, and no one is sure why. Let's go back to that first sentence. But rather than developing like London into a modern metropolis, so as if the people had a choice to say, well, we could be like the European cities, the great modern metropolises, but we choose not to. We're not going to develop like London. I would remind people here that London started off as a Roman town, a Roman settlement established by the Romans, and London was abandoned. The power of Rome contracted in the 400s, and that left the Isle of Britain, and London was abandoned. People repopulated the area a century or so later, and then it became, on its trajectory towards medieval London, which has the trajectory today. But it's not like all European cities are these, linear progressions, right? They're just as susceptible to this stuff too. But for some reason, as we'll just discuss in a moment, it's these quote unquote, exotic places that are the ones that vanished. At least that's how they're portrayed. So this is kind of where the lost civilization trope, really you find it. I think most academics are professional archaeologists are very averse to all of this, totally understand what's going on here. But through perhaps this emphasis on the decline, you can see how it gets to this stage. So why does it get to this stage? And there's been research at a theoretical kind of level getting into this. So I'd like to share some of that research with you. It's not my own. I'm just paraphrasing here, mostly coming from the work of Dr. Michael Wilcox, an indigenous scholar himself, discussing terminal narratives. And that's basically what these lost civilization narratives are. They have a finality, an ending. It's terminal. And it fits in with the myth of the disappearing Indian. So let's talk about this more. So I'm just going to paraphrase from him here. So terminal narratives are accounts of Indian histories which explain the absence, cultural death, or disappearance of indigenous peoples. Most of the information communicated to the general public about indigenous peoples is associated with destruction and disappearance. And think about it for a second. I'm coming from California public schools. I'm not sure how universal this is, but what did you learn about when you learned about Native American history in your schooling? You probably learned about diseases and smallpox and the effect of sort of after the first contact with Europeans, all of the death that occurred. I imagine that everyone listening to that has heard about that. But in your school, did you learn about the American Indian movement in the 60s, into the 70s? And more recently, I wonder if school children today are learning about Standing Rock and the fact that Native American history doesn't end in the 1800s. It's ongoing because Native Americans are around today. There are 2 million, there are millions of Native American people. Yet in a lot of the way that Native American history is presented to us, it's this myth of the disappearing Indian. Where did they go? Why did their places vanish, right? And then following on, conquest narratives, disease, cultural and demographic collapse, acculturation, and the assimilation are all closely associated with indigenous peoples. So when no one asks what mysterious, civilization built the Colosseum, you don't get that much in Europe. But, outside of colonial powers, these lost civilization tropes are rampant. So this is just something to consider here as we talk about, as we think about this. And I hope that everyone thinks about this as well, the next time you're presented with this sort of lost civilization ideas. And Dr. Wilcox challenges archaeologists in this way, asking, what if archaeologists were asked to explain the continued presence of descendant communities 500 years after Columbus instead of their disappearance or marginality? And with that in mind, I'd like to go back to the fecal Stanel record or population reconstruction and say, what does this data show us about what happened after Cahokia? And might there be something to be said about the myth of the disappearing Indian at Cahokia? So here's the fecal molecule data again, presented slightly differently, but we still have the x-axis with time, the y-axis with that ratio, which I'm just asking you to understand as more positive, meaning more people. And we've mentioned how around 1,000 we have our population maximum, around 1,400 we have our minimum. And if you follow the traditional narrative about Cochia, you might expect that the abandonment at 1400 would continue for several centuries until European folks show up. And in the 1800s, it would expand. And I thought that's how it would be too when I first started this. But when we look at the data for what happens after Cochia, that's not what we found. Oh dear, I'm sorry. Something must have gone wrong when I uploaded my slides. I apologize, but I'll show you in just a few slides what I mean. And I will explain real quickly what is actually happening. What we see is that right after 1400 CE, we find a rebound that occurs in the population, or in the fecal stannals. That has a local maximum around the mid-1600s. And it's much more modest than the population maximum assumed to have happened in the 11th century. So it's much smaller, but it still is occurring. And the fact that it happens before 1700, which is the arrival of Europeans to the area, tells us that it must be associated with Native American people. So I apologize that I have this kind of ghost, this is the trope of the lost slide that was in here, and this is on me. I thought I had checked everything perfectly. Anyway, knowing that we have this modest rebound that occurs by the mid-1600s, that is at odds with archaeological data. And so there's a lot of pushback on our data when we first presented it to say, hey, look, it seems that there might have been this second occupation of the Cahokia region by indigenous people that we haven't talked much about. And archaeologists were quick to point out, hey, man, there's no archaeological sites dated to this area, to this time period around Cahokia. So sure enough, I went out and I got site files and site records for a radius around Cahokia. And there are hundreds of sites dating to the Mississippian period and the period before it, which is when we had the height of Cahokia and then its depopulation. But there's absolutely none recorded in the proto-historic period, which is the period I'm talking about with this increase, this later increase in the fecal molecules in the 1500s and 1600s. And so the thing was, okay, well, there's no archaeological evidence, so something must be wrong with your data. But I stopped for a second. I said, well, hold on for just one moment, because I mean, Cahokia, we know that there must have been indigenous people around Cahokia at the time of European contact because it's called Cahokia. I mean, when French missionaries came here, they encountered an indigenous group, and the group is called the Cahokia Tribe, which was a sub-tribe of the Illinois Confederation. And so the French missionaries wrote down on a map Cahokia, and that's how we know the name of the place and what we've now called the archaeological site. So it's named after a group of indigenous people present in the early 1700s. Furthermore, we know that there was enough local people for the French missionaries to establish a mission at the archaeological site of Cahokia. So we have archaeological evidence of this chapel that was constructed atop Monk's Mound, which follows a long tradition of colonial powers in the Americas building churches on top of prehistoric monuments. That aside, we've got this chapel, and you don't just make a mission for one or two people. That there must have been a substantial amount of people around Cahokia at this time for this mission to even be worth taking place. And it's not too crazy to think that if we have an indigenous group present here in the year 1600, that they would have been present for some time before Europeans arrived in this area. So I believe that what we're seeing in this kind of population increase that reaches a peak in the mid-1600s, right before the arrival of Europeans, is that we're seeing the peopling of this area by the Illinois Confederation. And I think it really starts to make sense when you consider various other things in addition to history. If you think about the kind of way of life of the Illinois people, they had a very different subsistence strategy than Mississippians at Cahokia hundreds of years before. They were semi-sedentary. So they'd live in villages in the fall and spring when doing some farming. But during the summer months, they would be large bison hunts that would take them far afield. And we know that during the 1500s and 1600s, there was a shift in the ecotone, or the boundary between two different environments. In this case, woodlands on the east and prairie on the west. And today, Illinois is more kind of in the woodlands category. But 500 years ago, it became more of a prairie, more of a grassland. And that's what this map shows in the kind of darker shaded part of the map. That is where the prairie kind of extended at that time period. And so that prairie would have been great habitat for bison, which were, a main source of food for Illinois people coming to this area that we knew were present in 1700. So it makes sense that maybe a little bit before then, they're utilizing the space around Cahokia. Additionally, there's environmental kind of further environmental evidence that backs up this notion, and it's specific to the site. So I haven't got into this much in this talk, but I've done a lot of work looking at reconstructing what the environment was like around Cochia. And from pollen data generated by a colleague of mine, we note that, which is shown in the green curve on the, which is on the graph to the right of this slide, you'll note that coincides with this population high in the mid 1600s. So where we say, hey, we think that this is a time where there'd be more prairie, sure enough, that's when we find the most grass pollen. In addition to that, if you go one set of data next down, that black line is charcoal that collected in the lake cores. And the charcoal is also at a high with people in grass. And I wonder if they're all related, that what we're seeing here is cultural burning of the landscape, which is well documented in many parts of the world by primarily hunter-gatherers, as a way of keeping a habitat that you are adapted to, and trying to keep saplings and bushes at bay to maintain this grass environment, because it's to keep the main source of game that you're eating around. And finally, this last set of data here I have at the bottom is oxygen isotopes. I won't get too much into this today, but I had shown that during Cahokia's depopulation several hundred years before this, the environment was very dynamic. There's a lot of change going on. But during this period of this kind of after Cahokia indigenous population of the region, there's not a lot of change environmentally in terms of just in terms of water, in terms of hydroclimate. It's pretty constant. And that's a good thing, right? You like predictability. If you're coming back to this place next year, you want it to, look pretty much the same. So you know what to bring, what to expect, what sort of animals and plants you can use. And if that changes, that's not necessarily a good thing. So all of that to me comes together to suggest that, yes, there is this later presence of indigenous people around Cochia. And I'm not trying to say that they're of the same amount of numbers as what was supported around 1100. I mean, not thousands of people. Their way of life is different. They're not making mounds, but it's indigenous, occupation of this space after this famous abandonment. And I'm trying to say that the persistence of native peoples in this area doesn't end at 1400. It continues, and it continues to the present. Because if we, look forward, what ends up happening is we get into the 1700s and 1800s, and the fecal scales start to decline through the 1700s, reach a low at the beginning of the 1800s, which I think has to do with some explanations that are familiar to us. disease starting to become a problem now in particular. We also have a lot of warfare going on, both between native groups and, allied with colonial powers. Spain, France, Britain. Native folks are very much caught up in all that, as well as battles between native groups. It's a lot of warfare during this period, which would do a number on population. And then finally, we have to take into account the expansion of the United States. So in the 1700s, this is very much the frontier. But by the 1800s, Illinois is really starting to become settled by, Euro-American folks. And there's a series of events where native people are pushed off their land. And with the Illinois people, which the Cahokia are a component of, they start to sort of consolidate around one of the other subtribes called the Peoria tribe. And the Peoria tribe is pushed into Oklahoma, as what happens to many native groups in the 1800s throughout the United States. And they're there. I mean, you can go talk to Peoria people. You can go to the reservation. You can visit their website. And they're doing great. They're still maintaining connections to this area, although they're geographically, the reservation is removed from here. But there's still a continuity with the place. And despite what I think is a pretty clear historical record documenting all of this, you still have anthropologists who, as recently as the 1970s, are saying that the Illinois tribe is culturally extinct, and really pushing a terminal narrative, and saying, we have this loss, and this is beyond Cahokia at this point. They're trying to say that the Illinois people we've been talking about more recently, they're gone as well, but it's not true. And anthropologists, this doesn't happen just in Illinois and California. Bay Area skeptics. I mean, a lot of coastal tribes. Anthropologists out of UC Berkeley, 100 years ago, were trying to argue that certain tribes were extinct, even though people are around, right? And the effects of this can be sinister. It can keep recognition, of property rights from happening, and it can basically try to erase culture. Is what's really going on. And it doesn't just happen in America. You can find these lost civilization tropes that get related to trying to erase people's past in most places. So another example of a lost civilization trope is Great Zimbabwe. So the country of Zimbabwe is named after an archaeological site, actually, called Great Zimbabwe. And although Zimbabwe is now an independent nation, when it was under the control of colonial powers, colonial archaeologists argued that this was a lost civilization, that whoever built this, they're not here anymore. They're a mysterious people. I think they might be related to the Queen of Sheba. Not me personally. I'm just saying things that seem very far-fetched, but refusing to acknowledge the truth until other archaeologists came along. That local folks are the descendants of the people who made these monuments, and trying to sort of say, you couldn't do this. This is something that someone else did. It's not you. They're vanished. They're gone. You're something else, right? It's pretty damaging. Another example that's perhaps more famous is, just the Maya. You can, there's all sorts of YouTube stuff. Don't even get me started on some of what goes on in those parts of the internet, but I love YouTube for certain ways, but other times it's just kind of depressing. Anyway, the Maya people, you can find all sorts of examples of, the mysterious lost Maya, but you can go to Guatemala and hear a conversation in Mayan, in Maya, in one of multiple Maya languages. There are millions of Maya people that exist, So the parting message that I have for the talk today, and getting to the theme of this society, is to be skeptical of lost civilization narratives. What are they talking about here? Are we talking about an archaeological site that's abandoned at a certain place and certain time? Because that's fine. I mean, that happens throughout history in all sorts of places. Or are we trying to say that this is a culture that is lost, a people that is lost, that go away? They're no longer around. And what are the implications of that? Because quite often that's not true. And there are people who still affiliate themselves with that culture, are part of that culture. And by promoting these lost civilization ideas, we are denying folks their heritage in a certain sense. So please be skeptical of these lost civilization narratives, identify them, and I think we will do a better job at getting to the truth of world history. So thank you, everyone, for listening to me speak tonight, and for inviting me to talk. It's been fun.
Thank you, AJ. That's that was really fun and really interesting, and I enjoyed it very much. Some of the people watching this know me because I've been in Bay Area skeptics for a long time, and some people know that I'm an anthropologist as well. So this was near and dear to my heart, and especially as a Midwesterner, I know Cahokia pretty well. Actually, it's and I did not know that it was a World Heritage Site, though. That's really quite fabulous and very deserving. I mean, it's a fabulous place.
I'll jump in for 1 second, Gene, and just say that it is a state park. It's amazing that it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site on one end, but it doesn't have national federal recognition. So it really deserves to be a national monument, and there is a push to make it such. So if you see anything that you can support that, I think it's worthwhile, because it really could use that funding and that protection from the government, because right now it's only protected at the state level. Sorry, please go on. Yeah,
I could not agree more than with you more than that. That's a fabulous idea. If I run across any efforts to call that to the attention of, let's see, that's the Interior Department, isn't that the one that makes those decisions? We got to push that. That would be really great. But big picture, human beings, since they started living in large groups, after incipient agriculture and the agricultural revolution, keeping animals and so forth. We have seen booms. We have seen, I hate to use the word booms and busts because you corrected us on that, but they happen. There are circumstances where populations expand and then populations decline. I think your point is exceptionally well taken, that just because a population declines, don't fall into this trap of thinking they're all gone, because they're still there. It's funny because apropos of your talk tonight, I was just reading something the other day. It was a popular account, might have been New York or something like that, but from a reporter who was reporting from Honduras and having, talking about today's Middle America, Mesoamerica, the corruption in the various governments and the difficulty that any reformers are having, and how this is contributing to the migrant problem. And he was talking about how back in the 70s, this is John Anderson, who's a very good reporter. He was talking about how back in the 70s he was actually living in Honduras, and he went out with this Maya guy who is a ciclero, collecting chicle, which was sort of the foundation for chewing gum for a long time. And he was going out tapping the trees, and he talked about these wonderful big vine-covered sites that he had seen out in the jungles that were not known to anybody, archaeologists, because this is way back in the in the boonies, and John said, well, those were built by your ancestors, and he was stunned. He had no idea of that. Now, that was back in the 70s. I think things have probably improved since then, because that was 40 years ago. But still, the fact that you could have people living in an area in which maybe centuries or millennia ago there had been major population centers, major civilizations, and even the descendants of those people are no longer aware of their past. That certainly happened in places like Ireland. That there was a lot of Scandinavia and so forth. So being aware of these population growths and declines that's just part of human culture. I mean, this has just happened over and over and over all over the world. It might be worthwhile just taking a moment to talk about some of the causes of those kinds of declines. You said you weren't going to go into it, but now I'm going to ask you to please Google it, because we've talked so much about Cahokia that listeners are a little more aware of the site. But what are some of the ideas that are being hypothesized to explain the decrease in population and activity? And they didn't build mounds anymore after about 1400.
Right. So I'll preface this by saying that while I do agree that this is worth talking about, that we're not going to have a discussion here, and we're going to keep going beyond this and not just fall into that trap. Because the clients, I think everyone is drawn to it. It's an engaging subject, and I think it's something that we think about a lot now, as we have a lot of anxiety about things like climate change and things that seem to indicate at least population change, possibly population loss, right?
Mm-hmm. Your work shows population loss. I mean, it happens. Yeah,
it does. Yeah. Again, I'm not trying to say that didn't happen, and I have studied this, and I'll tell you right now, what I think. Around, it's not clear exactly, the starting point for this depopulation, but let's say by the middle of the 12th century, it is certainly in a decline. I'll give you my ideas first, since they're on the top of my head, and then I'll tell you what some other researchers have thought. But I think as researchers, we kind of look most to like what we study most. And I'm studying lake cores. And so I'm looking at what a colleague has hypothesized, which is that in one of the lake cores that we did this fecal molecule method on, he identified a flood event of the Mississippi River. And sure enough, right after that flood event, shortly thereafter, the fecal molecules are in decline. Now, that's a correlation, not necessarily causation, but it is interesting that they do follow that pattern. And I think it's sensible to say that a large Mississippi River flood would be bad, because we have plenty of historical evidence to say that it has been documented as a bad thing when the Mississippi River really floods. And this one around sometime towards the end of the 12th century is a big one. It's a bad one, right? Now, of course, that alone probably wouldn't be something that would lead to this protracted decline. But let's just put it in like sort of a tally, right? So that's one thing. Then I did some work with my colleagues on oxygen isotopes within the lake sediment, which can be a way of getting at what water, specifically precipitation, was like. And other researchers have suggested that there were droughts in the latter half of the 12th century. That's what we see as well in the cores. And again, they're happening right after we have that decline, or right during the decline in the fecal molecules. So I think that there's multiple environmental problems that are at play here that you can almost consider to be manifestations of climate change after the medieval climatic anomaly is transitioning to the Little Ice Age. It's a dynamic time for the climate. Now, how that would have affected people, I think, is unevenly. I think that folks who had farms that were well drained would have been in a bad position during a drought. Your soil couldn't have held water that much. And there's a lot of variability in the soils in the Mississippi River Valley due to various pulses of sedimentation over the years. Some soils are different than others. So if you had a plot that was an area that could hold water, you might be better off than your neighbor. If you're in the lowest part of the floodplain, you're going to be most impacted by the floods. There's farming going up, and higher elevations, they're not going to be as impacted by the floods. So I think it could have been a way of driving inequality. And that perhaps we do note that around after 1200, there's a change in what's going on in the site. There's less mounds being made, but the mounds that exist are being built up. And there's more prestige good production, which to me kind of suggests that maybe there's kind of debts that are starting to be drawn out here, where folks couldn't all more evenly contribute to things like feasts. Maybe, other people said, hey, I'll employ you. You can make nicer things. And it might have thrown off a balance that was in existence before this, driving inequality, which could have people who perhaps enjoyed their social status before said, no, thanks, I'm going to try again elsewhere. Or perhaps, people just said, oh gosh, I can't survive by what I have now. I'm going to try somewhere else. So that's kind of a hypothesis that I'm working with, that I'm actually developing further right now. And in terms of how climate change might drive inequality. And we know that that happens right now. So why wouldn't it have happened 800 years ago? Other folks, there's been a lot of other stuff mentioned. This is just kind of a bizarre one, but it's the first one that popped in my head. This is along the New Madrid fault zone. And there was an earthquake that happened that was quite large. Maybe that could have been problematic. Some folks have thought that environmental degradation, through people over foresting, which would make the soils poorer through time. And we actually looked at this hypothesis, whether it would show up in our lake cores in terms of you'd expect there to be more erosion if there's a lot of deforestation, and we don't see that. So I personally do not see a lot of evidence for environmental degradation. Other people would tell you something different. So that's a difference of opinion there.
Work in progress. But I think, I think the bottom line that maybe a lot of people who don't consider prehistory, cultures change. Sure. And this is true today. It was true 1,000 years ago as well. Jay, do we have any questions? Jay himself asks, are there actual examples of lost civilizations where cities were simply abandoned? If so, how do we know Cahokia isn't one of them? Well, I think you maybe answered the second part, but are there examples of abandonment of true lost civilizations?
That's a really good question, Jay. So I'm going to say civilizations, no, but sites, yes. So by definition, archaeological sites are abandoned, right? I mean, like they're places that have entered the archaeological record. They're not in use anymore. And archaeologists would be out of a job if that didn't happen. And you can certainly find tracts of land where there used to be, people living there. Now they're not. In terms of cities, well, Cahokia is an interesting one because I think that folks were using the area around Cahokia after that 1400 AD mark, but I don't think they were using it as a city at 1400. So under what we're talking about, yes. And the whole point of this talk was to say, sure, that happened, but like, do you call that a lost civilization at that point? And I say no, because the civilization, what is a civilization is a culture, and people who belong to that culture spread into various places throughout the Southeast and Midwest. And there are documented, cases of French explorers going to witness burials on mounds in Louisiana, where the culture is very similar. So that civilization, lived on. It just that's particular place at that time, not so much. So I think we need to distinguish between civilization and sites and places, because places can be abandoned, but people are harder. Cultures change, but do they completely go away? No, that would mean that everyone would be like killed at once or something, which doesn't really happen.
Machu Picchu was abandoned, but that doesn't mean that Inca culture disappeared.
Precisely.
Howard Wynett, Dr. Wynett, hello, Howard. Has the role of disease in Cahokia population fluctuations been studied? Which tribes in the area were affected by smallpox? Well, this obviously is after white contact.
Sure, yeah. So the first part, has the role of disease been studied? So it's been suggested. However, disease is really tricky to look at archaeologically, because most diseases they impact soft tissue. They don't impact the stuff that preserves at archaeological sites, which is bone for the most part. So if you have extraordinary preservation, you can get at a range of diseases. But unfortunately, where the science is at now, and there's some work that's being done to like be able to like look at like bacteria and DNA from bacteria that might live, or not live, but persist in soils. That's a really promising way to get at disease, but that is very much in an incipient stage. So maybe in 10 years, we could say much more. Right now, diseases that impact the bone, there's not a lot of them that are widespread at Cahokia. So it's possible that disease would have been going on. In terms of the diseases involving European contact, of course, that is after that 1400, cutoff time period that we talked about. And so, yeah, it does seem that by 1750, there are multiple epidemics that are going on in the interior of America. It had been suggested by researchers, this was kind of a big thing in the 1980s, that a lot of the heartland of America, before European contact had occurred, that people had already died because disease had spread rapidly ahead of settlers. The evidence that we talked about at Cochia in this talk is in opposition to that idea, because we find, a population increase, despite the fact that in other parts of the continent, there is definitely a lot of death due to disease. So I think that it's more likely that when you have interpersonal contact with Europeans, which starts to happen in the 1700s, that's when we start to find a decline again in the late 1700s. And there's multiple diseases. And what tribes in that area are mostly various members of the Illinois Confederation, which are living throughout the state of Illinois as its boundaries are now. Including like the Cochia. So this is a really good question, and it's much easier to talk about it in the historic period than the pre-contact period.
Yeah, back in the day, I was a bone and tooth person, and you are absolutely right about you're limited with what you can do with bones. They're nice for telling you about nutritional changes, from which you can make some inferences, but there aren't a whole lot of contagious diseases that affect the bone. Jay, do we have another question? Naomi Wasserman says, do your core samples precede the establishment of Cahokia?
Yes. So Naomi, that's a really good point. And I actually want to do more work on this. We have some samples that go back to about 800 CE, about 200 years before the traditional star of Cochia. And they're interesting because the population levels taken from fecal molecules are relatively high there. So they start off pretty high and then they go higher by around 1100. But that background that's already pretty high suggests that there's a lot of people living on the watershed around Cahokia that come together in this bigger site. So it would be like having various suburbs before there's really an urban thing, just kind of come together to form a city. So I want to do some more work into that, looking at, how dense was the local population before this? Did it just kind of suddenly happen, or were there's a lot of people around here? And we can get into this. I just think that I need a little more data before I fully answer your question.
And Jay asks, you mentioned that anthropologists as recently as the 1970s talked about sudden extinction. Has this changed, or is this changing? How do we eradicate this trope?
Yeah, I think it very much is changing. There's a far greater recognition among anthropologists to consider what we're doing, to be conscious about what we're saying a little bit. Hopefully I'm doing a good job of it. I don't know if I am, but the point is that sure, at the time they said, well, yeah, I mean, the Illinois Confederacy didn't look like it did in the year 1750 in 1976. And so he rounded up to say they're culturally extinct. And of course, the problem is that was totally just ignoring the modern people today who have a connection to the Illinois Confederacy, even though if it's not the same, but there's still a strong connection there. And I think that is an older way of doing things. I mean, Kroeber out of UC Berkeley was a very famous early anthropologist. He did a lot of work looking at, tribes, and he was looking at relative differences. We're saying, oh, well, this tribe, things are a lot more easy to see in terms of their cultural identity. Therefore, this one is alive. And this one that's harder to see, they've been around, settled peoples, so basically living more around the missions and early historic San Francisco, places like that their culture is harder to see, therefore they're extinct. So it was kind of a rounding issue that was cruel, and I think that I'd like to think that I don't think anyone taken seriously would say anything like that today.
Yeah, it's funny. I was listening to the Bay Area classical music station the other day, and this really interesting piece came on. It was a harp piece, and the rhythms were very, non-classical, but yet they were classical. And then the announcer mentioned that the composer was a Navajo who was apparently making a reputation for himself as a classical composer, but he was introducing Navajo musical elements into his compositions, and it was a very interesting piece. But Navajo today are not the same as Navajo were 1,000 years ago. Europeans today are not the same as Europeans 1,000 years ago.
Cultures change.
We shouldn't assume that a group is extinct because they don't do things that they did 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago. Cultures change. And, I totally agree with you. Finally, Naomi Wasserman has another question. Thank you, Naomi. Does your data tell us something about the rise of the city?
Yeah, I mean, so far, again, and I do want to do some more, collect some more samples before we go too far with this idea. But I do think that the fact that there seems to be a lot of people in the local vicinity before we have what we call Cochia suggests that its rise isn't necessarily like out of the blue. That sure, it gets built very quickly, but it's by folks who might have known the local environment pretty well and had a strong tie to this area. We do know that eventually, as Cochia really gets going, that quickly there are people coming from far away living there. And there's been studies on isotopes in the composition of teeth showing that people drink water that you can't find around Cochia. So they were essentially either immigrants or perhaps captives from far away. But I think that this suggests that the beginning of Cochia, it's mostly perhaps locals people who are making the brunt of the start of it. And I mean, that kind of is common sense, but it would be data about that. And I do have some more work to do about that.
Well, populations can increase by the intrinsic rate of increase of just reproducing, or they can increase through migration. And sometimes it's both. Well, AJ, I really thank you for spending an evening with the Bay Area Skeptics. This was a very interesting talk. You got a whole bunch of questions, so clearly people were interested in it. Thanks so much. I hope that maybe someday in the future you'll come back and talk with us some more.
I would be delighted. Thanks so much for having me.
You got a deal. Jay, can I have that last slide, please? I need to tell you folks about next month's talk. Somebody that Bay Area Skeptics members are very familiar with, Taner Edis, a Turkish-American physicist. You've read Taner's articles in Skeptical Inquirer. You've heard him talk at TAM and at SciCon. And he's a physicist, but he also is a philosopher of science. He's done a lot of thinking about philosophy of science and how it relates to pseudoscience. He has just published a book a couple of months ago called Weirdness: What Fake Science and the Paranormal Tell Us About the Nature of Science. I think you'll find this a very interesting presentation. It's not weird to carry a cat around on your shoulder, but for whatever you consider weird, come and hear Taner next month. Second Thursday, as usual, same place, YouTube. Watch you can find it at the bit.ly/Bass Weird URL. There's an abstract and some more information about the talk now. And join us second Thursday next month, January 13th, same time, 7:30. And thanks so much for being with us tonight.